So we're talking, we're talking late 70s, early 80s, and there'd already been some community stations start up in the big cities. We had Triple Z in Brisbane, 2SER in Sydney, and Triple R in Melbourne, PBS. There was a move to sort of expand, and there was funding around in those days. I guess there was Labor Party money around for the development of community broadcasting, and there was a couple of key things happened. By this stage, Oregon Records had commenced. I was working down there part-time at different times with Greg, just an import record shop. And in those days, most of the stuff that was, a lot of jazz and blues and that wouldn't get released through Australian record companies unless there was something that they knew were going to sell. So you had to import it, and there was a whole network of players through Melbourne that imported records through all those import shops in Melbourne. And Greg and Jim sort of got their to meet a lot of those people and work out that it was possible to run something like that in Ballarat. And I wouldn't like to guess when it started, but it would have been late 70s, I think. So Greg and Jim started it off up in Sturt Street, next to Frank Ford Travel there, just down from the GCs. And it was fairly life-changing for quite a few people, I'd say, including me, of course. Because finally I'd found, one, a few blokes that I could really relate to and talk music all day without them yawning, but two, they were starting to bring in stuff and open up to I guess a small sector of Ballarat, just what was around, and the fact that they could get their hands on most things from overseas. So, and obviously, so when it came to country rock, they could get the latest Jerry Jeff Walker album or something fairly, within a few weeks. Whereas, you'd have to find it in Melbourne or whatever, So, and it was a large enough shop that you could have a sort of lounge room in the middle of the shop for people to just cruise and sit back. And, you'd have, Woodsy used to have all the second-hand stuff over there for Butch to go and rifle through, so he had his section, It was mainly Kansas and all this crap, So we have Butch's section. And then so about 50 Kansas albums all waiting for him. And usually every Christmas we'd have a Christmas tree of undies in the front window. And we'd all have names on it. It was mainly the staff of Frank Ford Travel. and various. So one of the funny things about Oregon Records was it attracted the most unbelievable left to centre people, from Disco Dave to everybody. They'd all come in. Greg had this whole troupe of super weirdos coming in to entertain everyone, including the Mick Polonjo and all these guys. So it was just. It was a real dog's breakfast of people. And then you'd have a doctor come in who'd imported some classical album or whatever, So it was a classic little scene happening there. And Greg just had a pretty good sense of humour about the whole thing, really. And then Jim left and Greg took it on by himself, obviously. And that stage, Greg was touring a bit overseas. He was travelling a bit overseas and seeing, so he was pretty interested in the New York sort of loft scene, if you like, the jazz loft scene. So he'd head over there and spend a week or two and I'd take over running the shop. that puts the start of Triple B into perspective for me. Triple B, yeah, was that Greg and I went along to a meeting when there was first rumours that there'd be an interested group, and we thought, well, we'll go along because we're representing the music elite in this town. We're going to bloody go and keep them honest. No, I don't know what we thought we'd do, but we thought we'd go along, and what came out of that meeting was the idea, yes, it's something that's possible in Ballarat. There was people sort of from different walks of life involved, and there was people from the Community Training Centre. There were some key people there. There was a few people from Melbourne that had sort of past experience at what was happening at Triple R. So there was just a few core people, and I think they were lecturers from uni, and there was an interesting bunch of people there that said, yeah, look, let's do this. And one of the keys for us was that 3CCC in Castlemaine was already further down the track, and there was a chap over there by the name of Jeff Langdon who was 3 steps ahead of us, right? And he came over and he was dead keen to make sure that Ballarat happened too, because it's a community rising, So he came over and sort of said, right, this is how you can do it. I was involved in a tree planting cooperative at the time, and one of my roles was to come, not only to come in and sort of be an enthusiastic volunteer, but also to look at how we can pull this together. And through Jeff Langdon's help, we sort of got a bit of a plan. The group got a bit of a plan. There was a small studio set up at Mount Clear Tech High where we recorded cassettes, and they were sent down to 3PBS, and 3PBS would play them at 3 in the morning, and we all thought it was pretty bloody cool. So we had Greg and Paul Simmons doing Drop Me Off in Harlem and, a few things, and then we had a country show put together by Dave Jasper, and there was various little cassettes that used to head down, and that was at least we were getting broadcast. There was something to actually go out there and do. Now, it's hard to believe that there was so much enthusiasm for doing it, but, I mean, we had to start somewhere. So there was a little studio, and one of the people involved was a guy called Alistair Simpson, and Alistair's girlfriend was the secretary to Peter Shields, who was the principal at the School of Mines. And that's our connection with the School of Mines. And the long and short of it is that the School of Mines had some empty space at the back of the old courthouse where Fed Uni and Rexy Hardware and all them are now. And that was in the old jail cells. And we thought that'd be a fairly pertinent place to go, really, for a community radio station. So bars on the window, the lot. So we had a little space in there where we set up a room for a sort of office. We built one little studio, and we expanded to upstairs in the back of the old courthouse with our main studio. So we took over a whole section of the School of Mines old courthouse building, which was just empty rooms. There's nothing happening there. And that's when we, before that, and then we started doing test transmissions, which meant hiring a caravan, setting up some gear, going out to various spots around the region to see which was the best area to broadcast from, where to transmit from. So there was two arms to it. One was trying to raise money, and that was through writing submissions for grants. Two was doing test transmissions to satisfy the Australian Broadcasting Tribunal that there was a transmission space that was suitable. And I guess the third thing was setting up a cooperative so that we could run it as a sort of open community, a community approach to running it, so that there was committees, there was a programming committee, there was a technical committee, there was a board, and that we could take memberships, so to raise money, and we could also do it that way. So we set up a cooperative, and there was a program called the Cooperative Development Program, so there was funding there to do that. And that's where I got a role in being a paid staff member to coordinate all this was through the Cooperative Development Program. He funded me to coordinate it. So all of a sudden, I had a job for a year or so trying to pull it all together through that program. So being a cooperative, we could access some funding, and from that we could then do the test transmissions and then work towards fundraising to build studios. There was a lot of interest in alternative radio. I mean, we had Double J was happening on the ABC, and Double J was, so there was good music being heard nationwide on the AM band. But our aim as a community broadcaster and a regional community broadcaster was to make sure that every sector of Ballarat was represented if we could. So you've got to bring in the ethnic communities, Aboriginal communities, the gay communities, all that. So one of our roles was to incorporate those, and then also have different styles of music, different ages. So the older people got involved. So it grew out of us being open-minded about how you go about it, and that's just the way community radio should be, is to have the people not only that are unrepresentative, but also to try and make it so that it was listenable. That was the hardest thing, is trying to keep it so that people would tune in, as you can imagine. But because there wasn't much alternative on the FM, and the fact that it was on FM, that Ballarat would have its own FM station, wow, that's big. So anyway, we finally worked on, and we had some pretty interesting test transmissions in caravans in people's backyards and up on Black Hill, and we ended up on Warren Heap, which was fairly important. At this stage, there was two key players involved, really. Les Carney, who was Ballarat Communications, he was involved in one of the original people involved in telecommunications in Ballarat and sort of setting up data networks and installations. He was one of the key people in developing the studios, and also Lee Roberts, who was the key person in developing the transmission side of things. So I had two main men who sort of were my technical boys. Now, if we didn't have the technical expertise behind us, it would have been a really hard slog, because the technical people all had different ideas of how to do it. And what I wanted was a couple of blokes who really were switched on. So that was the thing. It fell into place because there was a couple of people willing to have a crack, and they were volunteers, and throw a lot of weight behind it. And even though Lee Roberts, for instance, wouldn't listen to it because he was into Deep Purple and he understood that this was something he'd love to do, is build an FM station. That was just sounded great to him, and he was right up his alley, really. So he developed the whole Mount Warren Heap thing, which, even though now it's just a part of voice, and that's the way it is, that was a really big thing, just building that whole installation up there on Mount Warren Heap. And from that came the ability to be able to broadcast out of our studios and start to go to football matches and broadcast Ballarat Footy League games, because we could bounce the signal up to Warren Heap. It was usually line of sight around Ballarat, so it was really good in that respect, which meant sort of building up more equipment to build an OB van, which had various connotations, because that meant that the OB van could then start being used to go down to the Bridge Mill Inn and places like that, and it wasn't only for sport and that sort of thing. So that's what we try to do, is get that OB van out and about. Outside broadcast van, yeah. So the outside broadcast van was, the problem was that in a city it was pretty hard to get up and out to Warren Heap. And so we found that the Bridge Mill Inn was fairly difficult to broadcast from, because even though it's down the sort of bottom of the hill a bit, you sort of line of sight to Warren Heap wasn't there. So that was a tricky one. We had to bounce it back to the studio and then out to Warren Heap. We sort of outgrew the old jail, and the School of Mines were really supportive of community radio. By this stage we'd had our licence. In '85, we finally got granted a licence. It was a fairly involved process getting a licence. It meant a submission to the Australian Broadcasting Tribunal and a fairly intense presentation of all the things we're capable of doing. They wanted to know that, one, we were capable of running a business, and we were a community-based organisation and not just a bunch of tech heads or whatever. Two is that we were going to be able to broadcast successfully from our locations, and we had the equipment to do it. So all those things had to come into it. So that was a full day of hearings with the Australian Broadcasting Tribunal, and they set up in council chambers. You had to go along, and various people from the community had to make presentations. So someone from the Ballarat Aboriginal Cooperative got up and spoke in support. There was various people, you know, I think Barry Brune or one of the teachers got up and spoke in support. Our president, myself. So, you know, it was a whole day of fair bit of rigmarole in getting a licence, but well, obviously we were successful. At that stage, we were still in the School of Mines in the old courthouse, but there was a fairly big groundswell of people getting involved. So early 80s, there was a lot of listeners, a lot of people involved. So we tried to set up Triple B so that it had different periods of the day where different age groups could listen, so that we could try and get sort of people coming and going in their listenership, which is the only way community radio can really work. You can't really listen to it all day because, you know, you got to sit through various styles or various. So we had talk shows in the morning and oldies in the morning, and then gradually as the day progressed, it got more alternative, and then the young people took over after school, that sort of thing. So it was all before Triple J came along, so there was a lot of younger people involved, and so that was that sort of Triple J type of music was happening. The old Triple J type of music was happening sort of from 4 till 7 after when the kids got home. So, and there was, so it went from talk to community access to music to around tea time there was more talk, and then into the alternative music shows late at night. That's how we worked. And then Saturday and Sunday were more accessible, what we call accessible, even though probably most people probably didn't think it was accessible. So we had some country shows, and you know, we had the blues show with Elka Bista. So we had stuff that was still sounded like Triple B, but were, you know, wasn't real heavy. So the metal shows were always, all the heavy stuff was on Friday night. After the Black Sheep, we had metal, and Dave Snedden used to come in and just thrash it out, you know. Oh, yeah. Like Mark Elliott was one of the enigmas of Triple B. Mark lived at home with his mum and had a sensational collection of music. It was mainly the people that impressed me were the ones that were natural when they came onto the radio. They were enthusiasts, and they were, you know, had things to present, something to offer. So Mark was one, and he spoke in a fairly interesting way too. And he used to have his little briefcase full of records. He'd come in and he'd play anything from Fat Swallow to Frank Zappa. So it was really, he was one that most of us, and he won the Biggie Rat Awards one year. Right? We used to have the awards every year, the Biggie Rat Awards. So it's basically taking the piss out of awards, but it used to be a getting together of all the programmers, and like Mark won it a couple of years in a row, and they was so voted by all the other programmers, that sort of thing. So, you know, he was a very popular man. So yeah, he was a Biggie Rat recipient. And then of course we have our Lou Kellys, you know. I mean, my interest was in the sort of blues, the jazz, the country and whatever, so obviously my favourites were there. But we used to have Rod May. Now, Rod May used to come in and do an organic gardening show, and he used to open the mic and then he'd just talk, naturally just talk about things. And he'd have a few notes, but not many, he'd just talk. And he was a classic, Rod. Rod was just well, he still is, just so knowledgeable about so many different things to do with agriculture. So, and then we had Over the Office Wall with Brian Wykes and John Owen, and they used to sort of bring in people from the Ballarat community, like it might be a city councillor, it might be something. So they worked for the Ballarat Business Hub, I forget what it was actually called. So they were key people to bring in key players in the Ballarat community to talk about what's happening in Ballarat, you know, from whether it be from Rotary or whatever. So that was always interesting shows. I mean, the Greek show had a fair bit of stiff competition. Everyone was fighting to try and get on, but there was only one Greek presenter. There was George, and George had to fight back all the others who wanted to get on. So George was sort of the rock star of the station, really. He was the Greek. And then we had Jake Stark and Bodan. They thought they were the coolest people in the place. Bodan, coming from Triple R, he was the sort of the godfather of punk in Ballarat, sort of, and the world, as far as he sees it. But he was, so he was obviously a fairly cool dude. And then we had Risk, with Erin and all the girls, and they used to keep me on my toes. And Sunday Girls, there was Larry Canoa from the Aboriginal Co-op who used to hold down, and then we had the RSPCA guys, they were good, so they used to come in, and so Mike Sheedy and Rob Brown used to come in and talk about, pet welfare and all that sort of thing, but they made it fairly interesting, they used to, because Mike was a vet, there was lots of things he could talk about. It was a bloody interesting show, that. So they were the sort of things that come to mind. I mean, there was heaps others, Noel Stingers, it was always a classic. And I guess, even today, and then Johnny Rugg, used to do Folk and World, and Charlie Flynn. Geez, all coming back to me here. Oh, yeah, I used to do a show with Sam Hutchison. Yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah, there was a few things. I dabbled in a couple of shows. I used to do there used to be a show called Ambience, which was just sort of, of course, my favourite show of all was Peter Newman's electronic music show, which was probably the first cab off the rank really to mention. I've got about 30 or 40 of his shows on tape, Under the Stairs. There was a period there in the early 90s, and I think I mentioned this the other week, where before Triple J went national, where regional community broadcasting was a really important thing for a lot of people to hear alternative rock and that sort of thing. When Triple J went national in 92, that changed a lot of things because a lot of people sort of went across to Triple J. At that stage, Triple J was still an alternative sort of rock and not the sort of pop station it is now. So that took a lot of the younger audience, and so we had to change accordingly. Which we still had alternative rock shows, but nowhere near as many. But that did affect, and that's where it's grown today, where community broadcasting, especially regional community broadcasting, it's a dogfight for funding. It's also a dogfight for listening with the internet and YouTube and Triple J and every other. So, it still has plenty to offer, but in the early 90s, it was sort of, a great thing, a really big vibe. So there was a whole groundswell of people to get involved with Triple B in those days. We also had Ian Stanistreet on board, who then went on to be station manager at 3PBS. Now, his father was the magistrate in town, Doug Stanistreet, and he came back to Ballarat and he worked with me for a year too. So when he was there, the whole thing sort of came together. I mean, we had Ian and I working together. It was a pretty good team. It was like Rex and Bags, there was just a team, So and then, of course, the whole Rex Hardware group of guys came along, and they were the young guys with all the energy and all the ideas. So, and they'd just sit in with all the old blokes, and it'd all happen. There'd be, between all of them, they got it worked out. So that grew out of that came more bands from local bands coming in to play in the studio and be recorded. By this stage, we had a separate production studio. So, people that couldn't get to record anywhere, or might have got down to Hodges and recorded some stuff, they'd bring it in or whatever. So there was Rex and all them were bringing in those people as well. Now the other thing that was happening was that there was the older groups were also involved, and the older groups had ownership. I mean, it's a bit like the Mechanics Institute. You sit in this reading room, and there's certain there's certain people that come into this reading room once a week that, you know, this is their little room, you know, where all our, so much has gone into developing it to be like it is. Well, it was the same with the morning shows with the older group. You know, you had your Frank Callahans and all these guys who, you know, were involved in this large group of older people who had the morning shows, and they had a fundraising group called the Casablanca Club who used to go out and do concerts. So they were a whole other area of activity that was happening.